Okay.
All right. So I want to thank everyone for joining us this Wednesday afternoon. We're very excited to have Dr. Latimore today to talk about the importance of aquatic vegetation. We're really excited. Many of you have already submitted your questions and I've passed those on to her. But if you do have any questions for her through the presentation, please just drop them in the chat and then we will address them at the end of the presentation. So before we get going, I just want to introduce Watersheds Canada and who we are. I know many of you tuning in aren't familiar with us and it's your first time attending one of our events. So I am excited to meet you and to just talk about some of the programming that we deliver. So the format for today, we're just going to do some quick introductions. Then Dr. Latimore will present. We'll leave time at the end for a Q&A. So if you'd like to submit questions or ask them live, you'll have time to do so. If we run out of time, I will be taking note of all of the questions asked in the chat. And if we don't get to them, I'll just pass them on to Dr. Latimore and she can follow up with you directly. At the end of the presentation, we'll also be able to show you a new education resource that Dr. Latimore and I have produced. And then I will share with you the details of the upcoming webinar in our webinar series. So the two people that are going to be kind of your guides today are Dr. Jo Latimore, and she is our presenter. She's an aquatic ecologist at Michigan State University. And I'm Monica. I work at Watersheds Canada as the Communications and Fundraising Coordinator. So if you have any tech problems or you have any questions about anything Dr. Latimore mentions, you can message me either to the group publicly or to me privately, or you can follow up with us by email, and you will get both of our emails as well in the chat in a bit. So about Watersheds Canada, we are a national nonprofit up in Canada, and we focus really on freshwater programming, mobilizing communities and individuals to protect and enhance their freshwater quality. So we do this in a number of different programs, the first of which on our screen is the Natural Edge program. So this is our shoreline renaturalization program. And we actually have these photos from just last week where our team is out restoring properties all across Eastern Ontario. And we're able to do this, thankfully, even with the COVID restrictions in place. So this is a really wonderful program for shoreline property owners, community groups who are looking to add habitat stabilization to their shorelines using native plants. And we will be ideally conducting our free site visits in the summertime once our lockdown is up in Ontario. So if you are interested in learning more about the Natural Edge program, or you are interested in learning more about native plants, you can go to the Natural Edge website at naturaledge.watersheds.ca. And I'd also like to point out that on that site, there is a free native plant database. So you can go through the database, put in different filters of site conditions that you might have on your property, and also characteristics of plants that you're looking to have. So maybe wildflowers or trees, and you can find those species and all of the different benefits of them that you can bring to your own property. Our second program that is run with the Canadian Wildlife Federation is the Love Your Lake program. So this is a shoreline stewardship program where we're going on a boat and we're assessing properties from the water and then giving each property owner a voluntary report that gives them different recommendations they can do to make their property more environmentally friendly. So we're looking at many different factors on the property. You can see the protocol in the photo on the left. We're looking at things like the presence of erosion, invasive species, mature trees, shoreline habitat, and we're able to give this property-specific report. Again, it is all voluntary and it's all anonymous, so we're not sharing other reports with other people on the lake, but it's a really great education tool to try and make your property more environmentally friendly and protect your lake or river's water quality. Another program that we run is our fish habitat programs. So we have kind of three main projects that we usually run. The first you can see in the top left is our in-water fish habitat enhancement. So this is where we're putting in woody debris back into lakes that may have been cleaned up. And this woody debris is really crucial for different fish, invertebrates, and turtles, as it provides them with areas to hide, to feed, and just to rest, especially from the hot sun. And so we're able to do this with the help of local volunteers, and that photo is from pre-COVID times. Another project that we run is our walleye bed enhancement project, which is the bottom right. So we're able to find historic walleye beds and enhance them with the help of local community groups. We also have many free education resources available on our website. These are run through our different programs and also in partnership with other organizations. So one that I'll be touching on at the end of the presentation is our Lake Protection Workbook, which was produced by the Lake Links Planning Committee. And it's a really great resource to just do a self-assessment of your property and all of those different factors that you may be experiencing, like light pollution, invasive species, declining water quality, and it'll give you kind of a checklist and a quiz so you can score your property and see what actions you might be able to take. As well, we have a new fish habitat enhancement toolkit that was just published a few weeks ago, and that was done in partnership with the Lanark County Stewardship Council. And it outlines all of those different fish projects I just talked about and how you might be able to run them in your own community. And all of these resources are free, and they are available at watersheds.ca/resources. Of course, you're all here because of the freshwater stewardship community. So this is a fairly new initiative for Watersheds Canada. We launched it just this year in response to all of the programming moving online because of COVID and just trying to connect people and provide resources to still take local action. So we've been blown away by the support. We've already had 850 individuals and groups sign up across 7 countries. And if you are not already a part of it, we encourage you to sign up for it. It's free, and we provide different webinars each month, as well as education resources and networking opportunities, which will happen later this year. And we would like to thank the S.M. Blair Family Foundation for funding. So I will stop sharing and just introduce our speaker. So Dr. Jo Latimore is an aquatic ecologist in Michigan State University's Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. She specializes in the protection and management of lakes, rivers, and the landscape that support them. As an outreach specialist, she works collaboratively with natural resource managers, communities, and the public to develop innovative solutions to the complex challenges facing aquatic systems. She has provided leadership for Michigan's statewide volunteer lake and stream monitoring program for 17 years, and also develops creative approaches to prevent the introduction and spread of aquatic invasive species. She teaches courses at MSU on aquatic environment management, science communications, and aquatic entomology, and teaches extension programs on topics like aquatic plants, lake ecology, water quality monitoring, invasive species, and natural resource leadership. In her spare time, she likes to spend her time on the water, kayaking, snorkeling, and fishing Michigan's waterways. So I think that is a perfect introduction to this presentation, and we're so thankful to have you today, Dr. Latimore.
Thank you so much, Monica. I'm really excited to be here. I was just mentioning to Monica before we got started that it's nice to be thinking about plants again after a long winter and thinking about other things. And now there's the interest in aquatic plants and aquatic life and our lakes and streams is really emerging along with the spring. So it's exciting to be thinking about this again. And I appreciate the great audience we have here, lots of people interested in learning more about aquatic plants. And this is a group of organisms, of species that is rarely seen, maybe poorly understood, but really important. So I'm excited to share a bit about them with you today. We've already went through my introduction, but here's my contact information, and Monica has that as well. So let's just jump right in. Aquatic plant communities is something that if you live along the water or spend a lot of time along the water, it gives you an opportunity to spend some time looking at the water's edge and building an appreciation for all the diversity that exists there. And when I'm in the world thinking about aquatic plants, I'm thinking about these communities. There's really a transition from the land into the water where we have 3 real clear aquatic plant communities. The first of those is the emergent plants. These are the things that will emerge out of the water's surface. They're rooted under the water, but they emerge out into the air. Then there's the floating leaved plants, and some of those have roots and some of them don't, but they're floating on the surface. And then there's the submersed plants, those plants that spend and live most of their life underwater completely, with the exception maybe of a flower stalk or something occasionally during the growing season. And those are probably the least understood by most folks. They're under the water. They're all seaweed, right? We often think about them as the weeds, and though there's a lot of diversity under there, and there's a lot to learn about and appreciate, and they have a lot of benefits for the other aquatic life, like the fish and the amphibians and the insects and the crustaceans like crayfish and things like that that live in the water really need those different plants to really thrive and survive. Before we dig into looking at the actual plants themselves and showing you some examples of the different types of plants that you might see on your lake or stream, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of aquatic plants. As we mentioned in some of our promotional material about this talk, aquatic plants often get a bad rap. They're often seen as something to control, to get rid of. They're a nuisance. They're in the way. We don't like to swim in them. We don't like to look at them. Our boats get caught in them, and our fishing gear gets tangled in them. But really, for a lot of cases, those minor inconveniences that might be provided by a healthy native plant community in our lakes are a small price to pay for all the benefits that they provide. And one of the first ones that I'm showing here is the fact that they can really absorb wave energy. If you have trouble with erosion along your lake shore, having healthy native aquatic plants in your lake can really make a big difference. Here on the left, you can see an image of a lake bottom that maybe doesn't have any plant life. Here's the lake bottom, a lot of sediment. When waves come in across the water, it's going to resuspend that sediment and send it up into the water column, leading to murky water and erosion and reduced water clarity. But when you have plants, the plants, their roots, their stems, their leaves, they all absorb that wave energy. And so when the wave comes in, the plants will move and absorb that energy, and the sediment on the bottom stays on the bottom, your water stays clear, and even the force of those waves hitting the shore that might cause erosion is going to be greatly reduced. And so erosion will be reduced, which most of us would appreciate. I already mentioned that aquatic plants provide really important habitat for things like fish and snails and invertebrates and all of these things that are part of a lake food web. Without that, you have basically an empty parking lot. And anybody who likes to catch fish knows that you go fishing by the weed beds, right? That's where you go because that's the habitat. That's where the young fish hide, and that's where the big fish are hunting. They also provide nesting areas for many fish species. So those are all really important habitat benefits that our aquatic plants provide. There's a whole lot of research that shows you get rid of the plants, you lose the fish. They produce oxygen. Of course, we all learned in grade school about photosynthesis and how green plants produce oxygen. And of course, that oxygen is really important for fish and other creatures that live in the water. And they also help with nutrient cycling. And what I mean by that is that anybody who's ever experienced a lake that has algae blooms or really excessive growth of weedy, maybe invasive aquatic plants, you're probably aware that part of the problem is excess nutrients making their way into the lake. In a lot of cases, that's phosphorus. It can also include nitrogen and other nutrients. A healthy native plant community can help use up a lot of those nutrients because they use them to grow and keep your water clear, prevent unnatural algae blooms, cloudy water, and that kind of thing. So they're really important. This healthy plant community is allowing this snorkeler to see far under the water because the nutrients that are making their way into the lake or from the lake bottom are being used by the plant life there, and the water stays clear. Aquatic plants also provide competition to algae for those nutrients. You see the cartoon that I have here, where on the top you have a healthy plant community and the water's nice and clear. Without those plants, green water is likely to occur because something's going to use the nutrients. And if, for example, we go in and do plant management and remove the aquatic plant community because we don't like the weeds growing in the lake, there's still nutrients there and something's going to use them, and it'll be the algae. And most people would prefer to have some plants in their lake than a pea soup lake of algae. So that definitely has water quality implications. I think they're beautiful. Take a look at this photo, one example of some photos taken while snorkeling in a healthy Michigan lake. And you can see there's this diversity of aquatic plant shapes, heights, leaf forms. We've got some longer, slender leafed plants growing here. We have a leafy pondweed species growing over here. Of course, there's happy fish swimming among them. It's really beautiful. Think about how much we appreciate a healthy natural prairie or a forest. We have that same kind of diversity in our lakes if we take the time to take a look. And finally, a lot of research has shown that a healthy native species community of plants can really impart some resistance to invasive species. Basically, if the habitat's already full of native plants, where would an invasive plants really get a hold? So, they are helpful in keeping the lake healthy enough to resist new invaders if they were to come in. So really what we're talking about here is an underwater forest. What we normally see is what we can see above the water, the forest along the lake shore. And we enjoy that, and we, protect our shorelines through programs like Monica talked about that Watersheds Canada provides. We enjoy fishing around these plants, and there's a whole nother forest to be found underwater with a whole lot of diversity and interesting different features these different plants have. So let's dive in, to use an overused pun in the aquatic world, and look at some of these different kinds of plants. And so the first group, I mentioned this before, were things like the emergent plants. The common species that you might see emerging out of the water surface would include bulrushes, cattails, arrowheads, and spikerush. We have our floating leafed plants. Common species include yellow and white water lilies, water shield, floating leaf pondweed. We'll look at some of these in a minute. And then, of course, the most misunderstood group, the submersed plants. Pondweeds are what you're seeing mostly in this picture. There's our milfoils, of which we have many natives, not just the invasive one, bladderworts, and even some macroalgae, plants that are actually classified as algae. They don't have true roots or leaves, but when we look at them, to us, they look like a typical plant until we start to look closer and notice those missing features. So we'll go through all of those, but first, to really be ready, we want you to feel like after this talk, when the aquatic plants start growing in your local lakes, that you can go out and maybe do some identification and identify some of these plants for yourself. And I'll note a couple of good books for that too in a minute. Many of you have done this before. If you're interested in nature at all, you've probably done a little bit of plant identification in the past. So, our typical tree leaf features that we look at include the leaf stalk or petiole, maybe these stipules, which are little features that grow near the base of the leaf and stem. The leaf blade itself, we look at the tip of the leaf and the shape of that. We may look at the margin, which is the edge of the leaf. We may also look at the veins, both this midrib and the lateral veins. And this is how you might tell a maple from an oak from a beech tree. But these are also features you would look at on an aquatic plant's leaf. For example, we have simple leaves, which is not divided at all. This is an example of a simple leaf, and here's an aquatic simple leaf. We have finely divided or compound leaves. This is a milfoil, actually, where this is a leaf, the structure here, and each of these little tendrils is a leaflet. This is a divided single leaf. Another feature you're going to look at would be some other finely divided leaves. Again, here's your milfoil style leaf, where again, this is a leaf, this is the midrib, and these are the leaflets. You may see forked leaves. This is a single leaf here. Or you may see branched leaves. Look how finely divided this leaf is. And this is a single leaf of this plant. That happens to be a bladderwort. You see the little bladders there, and we'll see bladderworts again in a minute. Also, as I mentioned before, looking at the leaf margin. Is it smooth like this one? Or is it serrated or toothed like this one? We see this on tree leaves as well, right? You might see lobes or teeth, that kind of thing. So looking at the edges of the leaves is important in identifying your aquatic plants. Another important feature is how the leaves are arranged along the stem. And the most common, easy one to explain is opposite leaves. So you can see here, you've got leaves there's 2 leaves coming off the stem at the same point. So kind of like this, opposite leaves. But you may have alternate leaves where you have the stem, and if you imagine I'm the stem, I might have 1 leaf coming off here and 1 leaf coming off way up here. They're not opposite, they're alternate. If you have more than 2 leaves coming off a stem at the same point, we call that whorled. So it's like opposite, but there's 3 or more. So that's a whorl of leaves. And then finally, there may not be a stem at all. And like grasses, the leaves are basal. They come right from the base of the plant, and there's no stem at all. Another feature of the leaves is how they're attached to the stem. You may have clasping leaves that, as you can see, they're clasping right around the stem. Or they might have a leaf stalk or petiole, where you have the leaf, and then here's this stalk or petiole. And finally, in between those two is the sessile leaf, which has no leaf stalk, but it's not clasping either. It's just pushed right up against the stem. That's a sessile leaf. Counting veins is important. We do that with trees too, and we're identifying trees by their leaves. And you can see as we zoomed in on this clasping leaf, the veins, including the midvein. So if you're counting the veins on this leaf, it would say 17 total veins, because you've had 8 on each side and then that midrib, which makes 17. And finally, a few other features that are useful to look at. How clear is the midvein? Is there one at all? Because some aquatic plant leaves don't have a midvein at all. What does the apex or tip of the leaf look like? Look at this one that has a really sharp point. This one kind of is rounded and then it comes to a little tiny point. Or the tip might have teeth, or it might be rounded or blunt. And when you look at aquatic plant identification guides, those are the features they're going to be asking you about, those features that we just went through. My absolute favorite book for aquatic plant identification, being based in Michigan, Aquatic Plants of the Upper Midwest. This is produced through University of Wisconsin Extension by Paul Skowinski, who is an amazing aquatic botanist and also the photographer of every photo in this guide. And there are photos for every single plant that he has taken. Photos of the plant itself, and then zoomed in photos of all of the important features you would need to know to identify it. It's a really excellent guide. And spiral bound, so it's really easy to use. And I know on the handout that Monica created, she included information about this book and this book, which is the other one that is also from Wisconsin, the state of Wisconsin, called Through the Looking Glass. And this one's been out a long time. It doesn't have photographs. Instead, it has line drawings of the plants and a lot of really excellent text information about the plant. Where does it grow? What eats it? Is it beneficial or does it cause a nuisance? Is it invasive or is it native? There's even some poetry sprinkled throughout. So it's a really nice reference. And between those 2 books, you can be in really good shape. And I'm sure there are others. People may have other favorite identification guides that they like to use. But I know when I teach hands-on classes on aquatic plants, these are the 2 that we rely on a lot for our classes in Michigan. All right, let's actually meet some plants now. You've got some background, you know all about them, what you would be looking for and what features. So let's take a look. And we're going to start with those submerged plants, those ones underwater that you may not have spent a lot of time looking at before. So those down here, the ones under the surface. And first we'll start with ones that have simple leaves. The first one I'll introduce you to is waterweed or water celery. It's a simple plant. It has no stems. The leaves are basal, as you can see, no stem here. And this is quite common in a lot of our lakes in Michigan, and you may have seen it too. It's also sometimes called eelgrass, for example. There's a marine version of it too. That's maybe more commonly called eelgrass. but it will grow in these long, narrow leaves, simple leaves with no teeth, no spikes, no anything. They just look like a nice strap of leaf. And a really neat feature of water celery is this spiraled flower stalk that it creates during the growing season. And the picture that you're seeing here is after the flower, which is a little tiny white flower, that's fallen off. It's past its prime in this specimen that we pulled out. But the plant will grow this long spiraling stalk all the way up to the water's surface, where the flower will sit and bob there and pollinate. And then once it's pollinated, it'll actually retract that coiled stalk back under the water to continue its growth and development of the fruit. It's really, really pretty neat. Another simple leaved submerged plant is waterweed, Elodea canadensis. With small, simple leaves, see how short they are compared to the water celery. And it has whorls of leaves, 3 usually, as you can see here, a whorl of 3 leaves. And those are scattered along the stem quite evenly. Now, this is similar to one that we're concerned about as an invasive species, and that's hydrilla. We're fortunate enough somehow in Michigan, we don't have hydrilla yet, although it's made inroads in surrounding states and provinces. You can see that it's a little different. First of all, the whorls of leaves, you typically have 4 to 8 leaves, so more leaves in each whorl, and also there are visible teeth on those leaves. So if we compare invasive hydrilla on the left to the native Elodea, the waterweed I just showed you, you can see a couple of differences. The number of leaves at each node, there's more leaves on the invasive hydrilla, and those teeth. And the teeth are even found on the midrib, on the underside of hydrilla leaves. While Elodea, they might have some teeth, but they're so small you probably wouldn't see them unless you looked under a microscope. So this is one, hydrilla is definitely one to keep an eye out for. It tends to grow very quickly and crowd out our native plants. There's another look at the whorls where you have Elodea here. They're on the wrong side. Here's Elodea and here's hydrilla. Another group of submerged plants with simple leaves are the pondweeds, and there's a lot of diversity in our pondweeds. There's 2 genera, the Potamogeton are most of them, and then a few have been divided out into a genus called Stockinia. But all of them have 3 key characteristics to let you know if you're looking at a pondweed or not. First, they're going to have those simple leaves, not divided, not forked, nothing, not branched, just a nice simple leaf, as you can see here. The leaves are alternate on the stem. So here, as you can see, is one leaf coming off the stem, and then down here is another one. So they're alternately arranged, and there will always be a mid-vein present in that simple leaf. You can see it pretty clearly on this leaf here, a mid-vein, and on this one, see the mid-vein is very clear. So if you have those 3 features, simple leaves, alternate leaf arrangement, and a mid-vein, you know you're dealing with a pondweed. This is the flower stalk here on the pondweed. So let's look at a couple different pondweeds. We have several species that have narrow leaves. As you can see here, they're quite small, and these can be tough to tell apart to species. In a lot of our surveys, we just say narrow-leaved pondweeds and don't try and get them down to species if it's not really necessary. Here's another one with really narrow leaves called sago pondweed. Again, you can see they do produce a flowering stalk that will emerge above the surface of the water, but they otherwise the plant is completely submerged throughout its life history. We also have a couple of others with larger leaves. These have broad leaves, and they also have a petiole or a leaf stalk. Here's Illinois pondweed. See the little petiole right there, the little leaf stalk. Simple leaves, mid-vein, alternately arranged. And here is longleaf pondweed. Look how long, oops, back up to there, I clicked without meaning to. That has got a really long petiole on it. And longleaf pondweed is cool because it actually will be equally as happy in a lake or in a river. With these really long petioles, it can kind of flow with the flowing water and it's perfectly happy there, or it does very well in lakes as well. That's our longleaf pondweed. Of course, reminders about invasive species, curly leaf pondweed. You can see alternate leaf arrangement. There's that mid-vein, simple leaves. But a key difference between it and the other pondweeds that we find in this area of the world is that, look at those teeth on the edge. None of our other pondweeds have a toothed margin on the leaf, no serrations. You might have to look closely and have good light to see it, get it up nice and close. I love having a 10 power hand lens magnifying glass in the field, but in most cases, these are pretty clear, the teeth. And if you see those teeth, and the reason that it got its name, curly leaf pondweed, is that, in my opinion, those leaves kind of look like lasagna noodles, right? They're really wavy edges. But sometimes if it's in flowing water, the leaves might be flattened out. So those teeth are the dead giveaway. So again, it's an invasive plant. It grows very aggressively and can crowd out some of our other species. All right, we just looked at two different kinds of broadleafed attachments. These had petioles, the last ones. These are clasping leaf. Remember I showed an image earlier of a leaf that clasps the stem? And there's a few different species of that, and you can see examples. We have white stem pondweed here that clasps about halfway around the stem. Perfoliatus will actually wrap around and almost hug to the other side. It really clasps the stem. And then one that creatively is called clasping leaf pondweed, which is the one we always use as our image for a clasping leaf. And you can see in all those images how those pondweed leaves are clasping right along the stem. I think this diversity is fascinating. I hope you do too. Those are the examples of plants that live under the water with simple leaves. Now let's look at some that have divided leaves. And here's one of my favorites, the bladderworts. We showed an example before. This is a single leaf on a bladderwort. And in this case, the bladders that we show here are fairly small, but they're still very evident. And where they appear on the bladderwort can vary. They can be on the leaf, they can be below on the stems, they can be above the water or down in the sediments on the stems that are there. Bladderworts do not have roots. They don't have true roots, but they do have underground stems that will hold them down on the lake bottom. They don't need roots because they are carnivorous plants. Just like a Venus flytrap or other carnivorous plants you might be aware of, that's what those bladders are for. Those bladders actually have tiny trap doors on them that if a little organism comes by and brushes against it, it will trigger that trap door. The trap door will fly open and the negative pressure of the empty bladder will suck in whatever is right outside. So if there's a little zooplankton, a little microscopic organism swimming by, it may get trapped in that bladder and then be digested by the plant for nutrients. As a result, the bladderwort does not need roots to get nutrients from the lake bottom. Bladderworts also exhibit really beautiful ornate flowers that almost look like tiny orchids. Excuse me. So here's an example of a yellow bladderwort flower, but we'll look at a couple others here specifically. Here we have the common bladderwort. That's the one I was showing you before. It gets quite large in some cases. And then we have a purple bladderwort with a little bit different leaf arrangement, and it will make a purple flower. It doesn't look like I have a photo of that, but it's shaped very similarly, just purple. And you may not notice these plants at all unless you're really looking for them until you see these tiny ornate flowers sticking up. Often they'll appear within a lily pad bed. And you'll say, wow, what's that tiny little bright flower I see over there? It's not a water lily flower. And you may find it is attached to a bladderwort. The next group of finely divided plants that I wanted to talk about are the milfoils. And of course, our brain always goes to Eurasian water milfoil, that troublesome invasive. But there's also a lot of natives. In Michigan, we have 8 native species of milfoils that can be found. And this is just an example of one pulled out from the lake. Oops, I'm going to back up. You can see it's got a long stem, and then the leaves are arranged in whorls, which is kind of hard to see here, but they're in whorls around the stem. And then this is a flower stalk that will stick up out of the water surface. Looking up more closely, if we were to cut off one of those whorls of leaves, you can see here's a single leaf. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 leaves in a whorl, which is pretty typical. This is the midrib, and then there are leaflets that come off, and the number of leaflets can help you identify what species you're looking at. The one we all know, Eurasian water milfoil, it tends to have a lot of leaflets, feather-like leaves with 12 to 21 pairs of leaflets. That's what we're seeing here. There's lots of leaflets on each leaf, compared to this, which is an example of a native milfoil that has fewer. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 pairs of leaflets on one of those leaves. Also, the Eurasian milfoil tends to have light colored or pinkish stems, and the leaves are very limp when you pull it out of the water. Many of our native milfoils, if you pull them up out of the water, they will stay somewhat rigid. The leaves will stay protruding from the stem, while Eurasian milfoil tends to collapse. It's also important to note that Eurasian milfoil has been hybridizing with our native northern milfoil, a different species, and those hybrids can be particularly resistant to herbicide treatments. So if you're battling Eurasian milfoil and not having much luck, you may be dealing with a hybrid that may take a little different treatment approach. Variable leaf milfoil. In Michigan, we don't classify this as an invasive plant, but east of us, some places do consider this an invasive plant. It's got this leaf stalk that sticks up out of the water. You can see this is actually a flower. These are all flowers at the base here and here and here. That will all stick up out of the water while the rest of the plant is under the water. And it's called variable leaf milfoil because if you were to zoom in really close, you might see there's occasionally a leaf that isn't part of a whorl. It's just on the stem all by itself. Eurasian milfoil will never have that. In fact, most milfoils won't, but variable leaf milfoil does. Another invasive milfoil that's not nearly as common but is worth being aware of is parrot feather. Now, parrot feather is easily distinguished because it'll grow a lot of leaves up out of the water. And our other milfoils will not do that. So it might have, the other milfoils may have a flower stalk, but they're not going to have all these different leaves sticking up out of the water. And they're also widely spaced, as you can see. They have short leaflets, and so there's big spaces between each of the leaves compared to the others. Here's an image of some parrot feather infestations found in Michigan. Luckily, we've only had in our state a couple of instances of it so far. In most cases, they're in retention ponds in residential areas and not in natural waterways, so they were easier to manage and get under control. But look at how it's growing up out of the water. It almost looks like a little pine tree forest on the water surface. So it's quite distinctive. And just for fun, I'm throwing in this weird milfoil. This is called dwarf milfoil or Myriophyllum tenellum. This is all you ever get. It never grows any larger than this. The leaves are extremely reduced to the point that they just look like tiny scales on the leaf. And to me, it almost looks like miniature little asparagus stalks that grow on the lake bottom. They're connected by a rhizome under the surface. So if you try and tug up one, you'll get a whole string of them. And I show this mainly because it's a curiosity. It's very interesting, a different milfoil, and you can amaze your friends with that knowledge someday. All right, moving on from the milfoils, here's another quite common finely divided leafed plant, and that's our native coontail, the genus Ceratophyllum. The leaves are arranged in whorls. Again, here's a whorl that's been removed from the plant. And the leaves are forked. Now you see the difference between the milfoil leaf that has a mid-vein and then leaflets coming off the side. A coontail leaf is just a fork, almost like a wishbone. And it might fork twice occasionally, but it will never have a mid-vein and look like a milfoil leaf. They often get mixed up, coontail and milfoil, because they're long and leafy plants, finely divided, and people often mistake one for the other. But once you look at the leaves, there's no mistaking them. Coontail is very different because of that forked leaf. Another group, a couple of groups of finely divided plants that aren't quite as common as the milfoils and coontail are water marigolds, shown here on the left, and the buttercups, of which there are several. They both will do the showy flowers, but they don't last very long, the flowers. Most of the time you'll just find the plant, and I'll show you a slide that'll help you tell the two apart. Water marigold, here's a whorl of leaves, and this is actually opposite leaves. It might be hard to tell, but this is one leaf right here, And this is the second leaf. These leaves are opposite, but they don't have any petioles. They're right up against the stem and start forking immediately. Compare that to the buttercups, whose leaves are alternate. See, here's a leaf coming off the stem here, and now we have another leaf coming off the other side of the stem, opposite, alternate, 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 alternate. So, and they do have a petiole, as you can see right here. There's a little petiole where they're attached to the stem. So those are our buttercups, and there's several species. All right, that wraps up our submerged plants we're going to talk about. Now let's talk about some that have floating leaves. And of course, the first one we think about are water lilies, right? Our water lilies, yellow floating heart is an invasive one we've seen in a few places in Michigan, but it's fairly uncommon yet. Those all have roots. While the free floating plants are things like lemna, or we call it duckweed, or frogbit, which is an invasive free floater. So let's look at some of those. First, we have our lilies. Very common. Some have yellow flowers. That's the species Nufar. White water lily, species or genus Nymphia. And if you look at those leaf shapes, you can immediately see a difference, right? The yellow lily is rounded, kind of oval shape with a curved ends on the leaf here where the sinus or the cut is. While you look at a white water lily and it looks like Pac-Man, right? It almost looks like somebody cut a pie piece out of it. Very pointy corners. So this is a way, by just looking at the leaves, even if you don't have any flowers, it's too early in the season, like if you went out right now, the lilies aren't flowering yet, just by looking at the shape of the leaves. If you've got Pac-Man, you've got a white water lily. But if it's rounded like this, you're going to have yellow flowers. Now, I'm sure some of you have seen a phenomenon like this in your lake. And many people, at least the first time you see it, wonder what in the heck is that? From a distance, it almost looks like you have an alligator in your lake or something like that. But on closer inspection, what these are the rhizomes or roots of water lily plants. Typically, they're rooted in the lake bottom and you wouldn't see them, but occasionally as the plant dies off or if the bottom has been disturbed, it's a natural phenomenon, they'll float to the surface. And so you'll see these strange creatures floating on the surface of your lake. And fear not, they're just a water lily root that's come uprooted. Another quite common floating leaf plant is water shield. Now remember, when we looked at the lily pad leaves, those had cuts in them, right? Like Pac-Man's mouth or the pie piece that was taken out of them. Water shield has an entire leaf, no notch, and they are oval or football shaped. Another interesting feature of these is that they're slimy on the underside. Water shield has like a clear mucilage underneath that's kind of fun to play with if you're somebody like me who likes that kind of thing. But they'll feel slippery and it can get really thick, especially on a young plant. And that's a defense against insects and other things that would eat the plant. That mucus helps protect the plant from herbivores that might eat it. So that's kind of a fun thing to check for. You can sometimes identify this plant simply by feel. You don't even have to touch it once you become familiar with it. Now those all have roots. The plants that we have with no roots that root into the bottom are our free-floating plants, and a lot of them are very, very tiny. In general, we call them duckweeds. Sometimes people think they're algae, but they are not. They're actually our smallest flowering plants that we have in North America. And so you can see this is about a centimeter scale. So you can see we're looking at some really tiny species here, and there's many species listed here on the slide. They have roots that will just hang down into the water for absorbing nutrients from the water column. They do not attach into the lake bottom. But when you pick them up and flip them over, you will see these little roots on the bottom side. And those are the duckweeds. Very popular food for, as you might guess it, ducks. All right, of course, there's always an invader to worry about. Here's European frogbit. This one has been spreading pretty rapidly over the last few years in Michigan, and I know in other parts of North America as well. And what you see there is it's a really cute little plant. The leaves are small, kind of heart-shaped, only 2 to 3 inches across. So they're a lot smaller than our native water lilies. They will grow a white flower with 3 petals. They have roots But again, they're free floating. They're not like a lily pad. You can pick them up, although they may be attached to a lot more plants. They're not attached to the bottom. Let me show you an image that shows frogbit, which, see how small it is compared to native water lilies. We've got white water lilies growing out here. Because frogbit is a free floater, it'll be up against things because the wind and the waves will carry it up against cattail or other things. So if you're looking for European frogbit, that's a good place to look, is along cattail beds, along the shoreline, protected places where the wave action has pushed it into those areas. When left uncontrolled, it can create great dense mats across the surface of the water. A couple of other floating-leaved aquatic plants of concern include our water hyacinth with its waxy leaves, beautiful showy flowers. This is one that's mainly escaped from the ornamental pond trade. People put it in their decorative ponds in the backyard. It grows really, really fast, and people aren't sure what to do with it, so they may dump it in the lake or dump it in the river. And then it takes off growing there. So this will float along. Here's a photograph of it. You can see these very unique leaf shapes. Nothing else is going to look like that, and the very showy flowers. Related to that is our water lettuce, another ornamental that has escaped. It again is free floating, roots that hang below the plant into the water column. The leaves are thick and ridged and fuzzy. You can see in this illustration, they feel like they're covered with felt or something. So they're very distinctive. They look like big fuzzy potato chips maybe. Here's a couple more photographs of it to give you an idea of the size and the shape of that plant. So those are invasive that you may want to report if you happen to find them. And then I'm going to end now with a few others that might be of interest. I'm not going to talk about the emergent plants today, like the cattails and so forth. That's a story for another day. And actually, honestly, people are more familiar with those than they are with the underwater plants. So a few other interesting ones I want to share with you before I wind down here. Musk grass, or Chara is the genus. It's actually a macroalgae. Remember I mentioned before that we have some plants that at first glance you would assume are a typical rooted plant with leaves, but they actually aren't. There's no true leaves on musk grass or Chara. It's just got branchlets, which are actually just single cells of algae. And so there's no true leaf stems or roots. It's called muskgrass because it smells musky when you pull it up. I think it smells like a natural lake, right? So kind of that musky, earthy smell if you crush it in particular. And it tends to be crunchy. Its chemistry is such that minerals tend to attach to it and make it feel crunchy in your hand, rigid and stiff. But it's a very beneficial algae of our lakes. It helps stabilize the lake bottom, provides habitat and food for a lot of things. So it's a good one. We like it. The one we don't like, another macroalgae, is starry stonewort. Now, starry stonewort is also branching, also an algae and not a true rooted plant. But it can grow and spread very fast and create very thick beds on lake bottoms, which we don't want to see. You can see that it's got uneven length branches. And then this key important identification structure is its stars that give it its name. These are reproductive structures. Bulbal is the term for that. And they can be seen, look how small they are on someone's finger there. And they are produced on clear filaments on the bottom of the plant. So that's how you would identify starry stonewort. Another interesting group, not a plant at all, but something you might encounter while being out and about in your lakes and streams, are sponges, freshwater sponges. A lot of people are surprised to learn that such a thing exists, but they do, and there's several species. This is an example of one of the more common ones that grows almost in a finger shape. This is a photo of a lake that I kayak regularly that has a real healthy sponge population. And then we zoom in a little bit and you can see it's porous like a sponge, and it even has the little spicules made of silica like glass that give it its structure. So no roots, no leaves. They often have algae that grow with them that give them that green color. And then finally, one other interesting critter that you might find would be the bryozoans. Here's a couple of examples. We have one growing on a dock here. You see this weird coiled patterns. People sometimes think, is this something's eggs or something like that? And I get the same question about the ones that grow as in balls. Are they something's eggs? This was actually attached to the bottom of someone's pontoon boat after they brought it out after a few months in the water. But these are actually small invertebrates that live in colonies. And they're actually a sign of good water quality. They require clean lakes to live in. And so they're a good thing if you find them, and they can grow very large. You can find these smaller colonies like the one you see here in the person's hand, but they can get big colonies of bryozoans, and they're a fascinating thing to encounter. All right, finally, one final slide. I know I had some questions that came in the beginning when people registered about how to manage plants, which herbicides they should use and that kind of thing. And really my message today is more about protection of aquatic plants. Yes, nuisance invasive plants should be managed in most cases, but we don't do enough to protect the native plants that we have and all the benefits that they have. So, Watersheds Canada and other organizations have lots of really excellent resources to help people who live and play on the waterfront to help protect native plants. So protect the ones you have, reduce disturbance to them, keep your shorelines as natural as possible, and get out there and enjoy them, learn about them, get your grandkids out there. Somebody mentioned in the chat getting their grandkids out to enjoy them. Notice and appreciate that they help improve the fishing in your lake, and so forth. And of course, yes, managing invasive species can help your native plants thrive, because invasives will often outcompete and crowd out that native diversity that we really want for our healthy lake systems. All right, I'll end my slideshow from there. Again, there's my contact information, and I also believe we have a little bit of time for some questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Latimore. Maybe we can start and just finish those ones that people submitted ahead of time. So I know that one person had asked if they were able to eat any of the aquatic plants found in their area if they are harvested from non-polluted waters, and how would they go about knowing which ones are safe?
It's a really interesting question, and there's not a lot of interest, interestingly, in eating aquatic plants. I'll tell you, I have tasted many of them with no adverse effects. I was just curious about them. What we know about aquatic plants is they are like 99% water. There's not a lot of nutrition in them. In the exception to that might be some of the roots and so forth that ducks will go after and stuff, so we know there's some nutrition there. One very well-known aquatic plant that we do like to eat, of course, is wild rice. That's a really great example of one that has got a lot of human interest in harvesting and growing, and lots of cultural benefits as well. Yeah, I would say I'm not aware of any guide or resource to harvesting aquatic plants for food, but I also have not heard about toxicity issues either. So, of course, just like you would with mushrooms or anything else, you'll want to do your research before you do it. But the nutrition value for most, at least the leafy plants, is going to be pretty low.
And then someone else, which I feel like has also been reflected in the chat today, is just strategies or resources to identify and remove invasives. So how do people know which ones they should be removing, and then how do they actually go about removing them?
Yeah, great question. So as I alluded to during some of my presentation remarks, yes, invasive aquatic plants are a problem, and we know that they're easily spread by trailered boats and recreational movement. People inadvertently moving them around. Boat launches are one of the most common places to find a new invasive, is at a boating access point. And so, what is considered invasive varies by where you are. If you're on the East Coast, something that's considered invasive may be different than when you're on the West Coast, for example. And so I definitely direct people to their state or provincial natural resource agencies or ministries to, obtain lists of what is considered invasive in your area. And those agencies can also help you find management control approaches that are appropriate. And there's a wide range of different control options out there depending on what plant you're dealing with. Hand removal or raking or cutting, basically mechanical removal, works well for some species, but for others, like Eurasian milfoil, which can spread by fragments, if you cut a lot of parts of Eurasian milfoil and they float away, each of those floating pieces can grow roots and create a new invasion. So you need to know facts like that. Biological controls like insects that might eat the invasive plant are another option in some cases. And then of course there's a whole variety of herbicides. There's big business behind invasive plant control from the herbicide angle. And the good news is a lot of those herbicides have been developed very carefully to only target specific species and not harm our native species. But that's only true if directions are followed, professional applicators, licensed applicators are using them. So again, referring to your natural resources agencies for the latest information on that is my best advice.
We have another question about someone who is looking to just have a selective reduction in plants. So for example, out of boat access or swimming, so they don't want to remove everything, they just want to have one area. And they're wondering what are some low impact methods they can use to do that.
Sure. So I can't address like what permits and such are required in every jurisdiction, but I can give Michigan's example. In Michigan, you do not have to apply for a permit to selectively remove aquatic plants so that you can get your boat in and out from your dock or even a small swimming area if the removal is mechanical. You're cutting them by hand, you're pulling them, raking them out, that kind of thing. No chemicals are being applied. You may go ahead and remove them. And that's really the lowest impact approach, is being selective, only removing plants from where you need to be able to enjoy the lake, while leaving a healthy plant community on either side of those areas, and removing them physically rather than using a chemical is probably the lowest impact thing you can do. In some cases, there are products like basically we call them benthic barriers or cloths that can be laid down on the lake bed to basically smother the plant life there for a small swimming area or boating area. We require permits for that in Michigan because you're disturbing the lake bottom, but that is another generally, chemical-free, low-impact approach if it's done in a small area.
We have some questions specifically about aquatic plants. So people are wondering how, you had mentioned the flowers get pollinated, so they're wondering who is doing that pollination.
One question, Monica, while you're looking at the chat, I saw it come in.
Oh, I think I've lost audio for you.
Plant. Oops. Looks like we had a little delay in the, I'm going to continue on my climate change question, then we can come back. Maybe Monica, I'll have you repeat what you had asked. Much is what we expect with terrestrial systems. For our aquatic systems, for example, warming lake temperatures may result in some shifts in the aquatic plant community. Some of our plants might not tolerate warmer waters or shorter ice periods, frozen periods in lakes and so forth. So that's something for us to keep an eye on. And honestly, there's not a lot known. Not a lot of research has been done on aquatic plants and predictions of how climate change may change their distribution. One thing that is suspected is that we will become more vulnerable to invasive plants from more southerly latitudes. While it gets warmer in the north, southern plants may be able to march north and get a foothold where we might not want them.
Sounds good. And I've also just put in the chat if people have a few minutes to answer our anonymous feedback survey. We'll keep going through a couple more of these questions if that's all right with you, but if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes just to let us know how we did and if you found the presentation helpful, that will help us direct future webinar topics. So what I was trying to ask you before was just some questions that people had about aquatic plants. So they were wondering if bees are doing the pollination. I think you had mentioned earlier that they're pollinating. And then people are also wondering if they are effective at absorbing carbon dioxide or if that's more effective with terrestrial plants.
Two good questions. Aquatic plants are almost entirely wind pollinated. So that's why, they don't require an insect as a pollinator. They wait for the breezes, or they use the water and the wind in combination, where pollen may be released onto the water's surface and then it drifts to a floating plant. For example, in the example of that water celery, that very first leafy, long-stranded leaf plant that I showed you originally. So actually, no, insects are not a major pollinator for our aquatic plants. The second question that you asked, Monica, could you repeat it, please?
Sure, just about absorbing carbon dioxide.
Yes. So yes, they do use the CO2 in the water, and water has a pretty high ability to absorb carbon dioxide. And so there's a lot of dissolved CO2 in the water column. And so yes, aquatic plants do, photosynthesize just like our terrestrial plants do. So they're definitely using up carbon dioxide.
Perfect. Dan is saying that he lives on Pike Lake and they found that the milfoil was really bad one year and then the next year it was gone. So he's wondering if you have any idea why that might be happening.
Well, there could be a few different things explaining it. Assuming there wasn't any treatment of the milfoil, that this was a natural phenomenon, there could be a few different things. Changes in lake level, changes in water temperature can select from year to year for certain species of plant to have a better or worse year. It seems like in the 17 years or so that I've been working in aquatic plants and aquatic plant management, every year there's what I call the plant of the year, where I get a ton of calls and emails about something that people have never seen before. And they, in many cases, are concerned it may be an invasive species, but that's often not the case. It's a really good year for, say, a native milfoil or water celery or yellow water lilies. And so they do really well. We see the same thing in prairies and in forests. The conditions are just right, just warm enough, just wet enough, that kind of thing. There could also be some other things going on. If there are some native insects, in particular a weevil, that the larvae is aquatic and it feeds on milfoil, including Eurasian water milfoil, and it will the larvae will burrow into the stems and cause the plants to collapse and eventually die as a result. And so if you had this helpful weevil in your lake and it had a good year and was able, basically graze down all the milfoil in your lake, that could have happened as well.
Someone is asking, how does the laminar flow aeration affect the plants?
That's a really good question, and one that I think we're just starting to understand. I know that it has been used in some lakes to help control Eurasian milfoil again, and some lakes have seen success, some less so. And in most cases, that work has been done by private companies who are trying it out. There hasn't been a lot of research on it to really document, at least not that I've seen yet. I think some is underway on really why it helps or doesn't in particular cases. So I don't have a lot more to say on that because we're still waiting to learn more.
So someone is wondering kind of about the impact. So maybe on an individual property, if they remove their plants, it doesn't seem like a big deal. But then if the whole lake is removing them, like what could they see happen to their lake? I know you kind of touched on this, but I do want to address it because it is kind of the point of this topic, just what impacts people can maybe expect to see if so many people are removing the plants.
Right. Yeah, it's cumulative, right? And so when we talk to individual shoreline owners, and I imagine a lot of organizations do this, we say, it's okay to clear a little bit, just don't clear your whole shoreline, right? We want to minimize that because we want to maintain as much native plant life as we can in the lake. If like you said, if one property owner decides, okay, we're getting rid of all the plants, we don't like them, we're getting rid of them, but the neighbors don't, well, you've just reduced the percentage of your lake that has a healthy native plant community, so that's a problem. But it may not be as bad as if lots of people do. But one thing that we do see And it happens with seawalls too. When lakefront property owner, if somebody comes in and puts in a fancy, nice new seawall along their shoreline to stop erosion, to make it nice and neat and tidy, they tend to be contagious because other property owners will go, huh, that looks pretty nice. It looks neat. It looks well manicured and maintained. They're not perhaps struggling with erosion. Maybe we'll get one too. And there's a lot of kind of social aspect to the way lakefront property owners manage their property. And if the thing to do on a lake is to install a seawall, then a lot of people are going to do it and may even start to worry, you know, what are my neighbors saying about me? Because I don't have a seawall. I have all these weeds and I have, you know, it looks really natural. Does that look messy? Maybe I don't want to do that. Well, the same thing is true with how you manage the plants in the water. If you see a neighbor or two or three start to get rid of all their plants, you know, people might start to worry, you know, do I want to be the weedy lot on the lake? Does everybody look at me and think, oh gosh, they're not maintaining their property like they should? There's peer pressure that people feel. And so that can be contagious too. And so I really encourage folks, if they can, you know, be the trendsetter, maintain your native plants as much as you can, talk to your neighbors about why you're doing it. And that goes for plants up on shore too. If you're maintaining natural vegetation on your shoreline, it's great. You know, some of the best ways to influence others on the lake to do the same is to talk to them about why you're doing it. And that, you know, we hear bird song every day and the grandkids caught a couple frogs out there, and, you know, they're not going to get that if they just have some lawn and no native plants and anything along their shoreline. So that's what I see the most of, you know, maintain as much natural as we can. And then we can also teach by example and maintain that in our own property to encourage our neighbors to do the same.
All right, I think we have two more, if you don't mind answering them.
Of course, of course.
So Adriana is wondering, in your opinion, what is the safest way to remove Eurasian milfoil? And do you have to have sample leaves to be compared first? So I'm thinking maybe, do you need to show the two, and then how would you go about removing it safely?
Great. So good question. You always want to know for sure what you're dealing with, what species. So have someone confirm for you that, yes, it's definitely Eurasian milfoil, for example. It's not one of our natives. That really isn't a problem. I mentioned the hybridization. The only way to know if you have a hybrid is to have it genetically tested. And so at least in Michigan, that has become so common. Hybrids are so common that it's almost the default. Before any Eurasian milfoil management begins, a sample will be sent in for genetic testing, just so they know who they're dealing with, right? Is it going to be resistant to an herbicide? We don't want to put herbicide in the lake for no reason, of course. So know who you're dealing with. That's important. And of course, then your decision is, okay, do I do anything about it? There's an interesting research study done in Wisconsin recently that looked at a lot of lakes that had done some pretty major herbicide treatment for Eurasian milfoil. And they had found that the native plant diversity had declined significantly in many of those lakes that had been treated, to the point that their conclusion, the researchers in Wisconsin, was that, you know, quite a few cases, the treatment was worse than the cure. If they had just left the milfoil, it may have just stayed confined to one part of the lake, not really had a huge impact on the lake, and they would have maintained more native plants. So that's important to keep in mind, that just because you have one plant of Eurasian milfoil in your lake doesn't mean you should immediately call in the cavalry and hit it with everything you've got and kill it. It may not be necessary. So I do caution people, if you have a really, you know, a small infestation, hand pulling is always an option. If you just see a little growing next to a boating access area, for example, you know, it's pretty easy to take an afternoon with some folks and go out there and pull it out and bag it and throw it in the trash so it doesn't get back into the water. And you're done. And you didn't apply any chemicals. You didn't have to spend any money. It was very easy. And so those small hand removals are definitely an option. But if you're looking at a lake that has acres upon acres, you're looking at lots and lots of Eurasian milfoil, it's definitely spreading, then in those cases, herbicide treatments really are a viable option. There are lakes around me that's the only plant that's there. It has completely wiped out everything else. And the fishing isn't good, and no one wants to swim there. No one wants to buy a house on that lake because it's just choked with this invasive plant. And so, the good news is when you know what you're dealing with, you have genetic testing on that. We do have some chemicals that work very efficiently and are very selective for what they do for Eurasian milfoil. So that's an option. What we tend to advise against is the mechanical harvesting, unless you don't care if it continues to spread and you're just trying to keep it mowed, because mechanical, like a weed harvester boat, tends to cause it to spread more than it actually controls it. I'll mention one other thing, treatment option that I don't know how widespread it is across Canada, but in Michigan it's growing in popularity. And it's called diver assisted suction harvesting, or DASH. And in that case, there's a boat, a pontoon-based boat that goes out on the water, and it has vacuum hoses on it. And divers will go down to the lake bottom and hand pull the individual Eurasian milfoil plants from deeper waters and send them up the vacuum tube up to the boat. And that way they're able to only get the milfoil, they minimally disturb anything else, and then they can safely dispose of the plant material up on shore. It's labor intensive and really expensive, but it can be really effective.
Thank you for that. I think that's a problem that a lot of people are facing. So I'm very glad that you went into detail on that. The last question that we'll do today is just someone who is wondering what your thoughts are about introducing an introduced species, for example, grass carp that are sterilized, to remove another invasive that they are having in their pond. So they don't want to apply chemicals because it would affect the wildlife that also live in the area, but they're just trying to figure out what to do to remove the invasive. So the M. aquaticum.
Sure. Yes. So I'm from Michigan, where grass carp are very illegal. But I'm aware of them and their use. But we found enough of them escaped and turning out to not be sterile, that they're not permitted anywhere. That being said, in an isolated pond or something like that, grass carp definitely will eat aquatic plants and keep them mowed down. That's why they're popular in aquaculture scenarios, because they're used to keep the vegetation growth down in these high nutrient fish farm areas. But they can escape. So that's something, if they are legal where you are, that's something to be very, very careful about. But they do, the good thing is it's something natural, right? It's a fish. It's not a chemical or something like that you might be concerned about. But they also need to be handled with caution. As I said, they can escape. They can reproduce in some cases. The sterilization, making them triploid, so they're genetically not supposed to be able to reproduce, is not foolproof. And so that's something to definitely keep in mind for that. But if you're dealing with an isolated pond that doesn't have any inlets or outlets and it's small, you may have some additional options available to you that might be too risky in a big natural water body.
Perfect. So I think we got through everyone's questions. And if you think of anything after this, you can email either of us and we'll be sure to follow up with you. I just have two last things to share with everyone. So the first is the next webinar in the freshwater stewardship community, which is taking place on May 19th at 4 p.m. Eastern. And it's going to be with Annabelle Slate from Clearwater Farms, and she's going to be going through a live demonstration of some different family-friendly activities that you can use this summer to help get your kids outside. And they are COVID appropriate, so no matter what group size limits we may be experiencing across North America in the summer, you will still be able to get out safely in nature with your family. And then the second one is just that handout that Dr. Latimore and I have created. So it's a nice summary of what she touched on today, links out to some different resources, and I think will be a really great resource to give someone along with the recording of this webinar. You can pass it along through your lake or river association or to your neighbors. It's a really nice soft introduction to aquatic plants, why they're important, and then also linking out if you want to learn more how to identify them or remove invasive species. So this resource will be available on our freshwater community page, and we're also going to be sending an email out later this week to everyone who has registered with the recording of the webinar and this handout. So you don't have to worry about remembering everything. You'll have these two resources to refer back to and also to share with others who maybe didn't attend live. And I did put in the chat the link for the last webinar, or sorry, the next webinar, and then we'll also put in the link for the evaluation survey. So I just want to thank everyone for sticking with us and for your interest in aquatic plants. I know we're all looking forward to summertime, which is coming soon, and just being able to see these aquatic plants, know which ones they are, and know the great things that they're doing for our freshwater community. So thank you so much, everyone, again, and have a good rest of your Wednesday. Thank you, Dr. Latimore, for joining us.
Thanks, Monica. It was a lot of fun talking about plants with y'all today.